Welcome to the Altered Call podcast. Today we are finally going to talk about hearing God's voice. Allowing God to speak directly into your life requires large degrees of faith and a near constant pursuit of Him. If you think you are ready, let's go. My name is Alex Pillischafske. I believe in judging by the fruits. I believe that FOMO is a cancer, and I believe that you are uniquely created to reflect God's glory in the world. There are two types of Christians in this world, the ones that claim they can hear from God and the ones that don't. We all know the ones that claim they can hear from God are the crazy ones, so why would any sane person want to go down this road? I'm not going to speak for everyone that claims that they can hear from God, but if what I've experienced is any indication, then I think that any Christian that writes off this idea is missing out on something life-changing. Crazy and unpredictable, but life-changing. Before we talk about specifics, though, I want to talk about risk. I am of the opinion that most people do not properly understand or appreciate the function of risk assessment. Understanding risks properly requires looking at many different variables, many different potential outcomes, and deciding which type of risk you are willing to entertain. There are no zero risk options. Let me say that again. Even the things that you consider to be safe involve risk. Most of us are just comfortable ignoring that category of risk. People don't like to evaluate risk in detail because as a species, we are undeniably bad at it. Even the people that specialize in risk assessment are still mostly guessing. They are much better at guessing than anyone else, but with the possible exception of life insurance, there is almost no data table big and stable enough to be reliable. Once you get into multivariate analysis, the task becomes much more complex, as you need to not only consider if the two variables are related, but how they are related to each other causally. So instead of learning about risk and attempting to leverage its lessons in our lives, we frequently settle for the more intimate feedback of our experience and gut reactions to things. In general, when people consider risk, they view it through the lens of the risk of loss. If you take a chance, there's a possibility that you might lose something. This perspective can be hard to shake because the pain of losing something is much harsher than the joy of gaining that same thing. I know an older couple that invested in mutual funds when they were young. They lost money in a market downturn and decided to pull it out instead of leaving it invested. Now they invest in individual stocks instead of mutual funds because once they transitioned to that plan, they did not have the same negative experience. Investing in a few hand-picked stocks instead of a reasonable mutual fund is undeniably riskier to the health of their portfolio. But because they suffered a traumatizing loss on mutual funds, they will never go back. In their mind, individual stocks are safe, if only because they haven't yet been bitten by them. Bad plans are easy to point out when they fail. They are much harder to get away from when they work. A fool that gets lucky or gets comfortable in their foolishness can quickly become a lost cause. I've seen this happen to a lot of guys in their 20s. They pursue something that they are passionate about, get some short-term wins, and convince themselves that they are a prodigy, only for it to collapse sometime later when reality reasserts itself. This brings me to a specific type of risk that I want to address here. What happens if your bad idea never falls apart? Let's say that you aren't taking a risk that will collapse in on itself. Instead, you are simply playing it safe, avoiding risk, avoiding potential pain and loss. This type of life presents the illusion of safety and stability. If you can just avoid critical failure, then everything will be all right. In the finance world, this is similar to investing your money in a savings account. There's almost no direct risk of loss, but you also deny yourself the opportunity to gain. The problem with this plan is that you are actually losing money in the long run. You just don't feel it. As inflation goes up, even slowly and reasonably, your money becomes worth less overall, and the small gains from the saving account aren't enough to protect you from the loss. So instead of risking money with a high likelihood of gaining value over time, you decide to take the safe route and commit to losing money, slowly and invisibly. If you start listening to God, there is a high likelihood that you will make mistakes. Some of them won't bother you, but some of them will hurt. You will be convinced that God said something that He didn't, or you will fail to act when He did say something, only to regret that inaction later. This is all part of the learning process. The problem on the other side is that if you don't start listening to God, you deny His power in your life. You deny the opportunity for God to direct your steps and show you where you need to be and who you need to become to most glorify Him. You can choose to play it safe. You can choose not to make a mistake and suffer pain accordingly, but you will risk missing out on becoming who He made you to be. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed talking to God, and I suggested that as a prerequisite to listening to God. So if you haven't yet listened to that episode, start there. Assuming that you've spent some time building a genuine relationship with God, let's keep going. Let's start by addressing how this topic often gets abused. I'm choosing, in the context of this podcast, to speak very boldly regarding God's presence and influence in my life. Not because I think that is appropriate, but in an attempt to reset the expectations of Christians that listen to these episodes. Unfortunately, there are many Christians that use God as a tool with which to dominate each other. I do not believe that hearing from God makes you any better than anyone else. It does create unique opportunities, but it demands accountability and restraint. Confusing your voice with God's voice absolutely happens. And as you begin to explore this path, you need to remain humble in order to avoid bringing harm to people's perceptions of God. There are only a handful of people in my life that I make a habit of sharing this type of information with, and it is generally for the purpose of discernment. It has also been my experience that God speaks almost entirely towards the actions that I should take, not other people, so there is no need to broadcast the information any further. Whenever I am working with someone on exploring God's voice in their life, I will aggressively steer the conversation away from other people. Other people or interactions will commonly be the trigger for God speaking into your life, but the message is almost always for you. Don't attempt to use "God told me so" as an excuse to overstep boundaries, and don't attempt to leverage God's voice in negotiations. This is almost certainly an abuse of some kind, and I doubt highly that God has anything to do with it. I once attended an event hosted by a church near my college, where the pastor made amazing proclamations about those in attendance, despite having never met them. The part that no one else seemed to notice was how curious and attentive his wife had been upon our arrival. It was clear to me that she had fed him enough information to get the process going, and then his charisma was able to take over from there. This type of behavior is disgusting, and I hope that in general the punishment for it is severe. God isn't some cheap trick to impress your friends, and He doesn't appreciate people using His name in vain. The other concern that I have centers around misconception. This process is not clear. We are about to dip into incredibly murky waters, and if you engage in these acts, you will almost certainly make mistakes. Hearing and responding to God's voice is a skill that can be developed over time, but it will almost always be a guessing game. There are certain things that I believe were told to me with absolute clarity, but those are very rare interactions and often come on the back of the hard work of discerning all of the other messages where clarity was lacking. Ultimately, pursuing God's call requires humility and faith. Try, fail, and try again. The first step in hearing from God is learning to discern His voice from all of the noise. The easiest way to do this is to start by reading the Bible. I know that's not a fun answer, but the Bible is the only thing that we have been told is undoubtedly the Word of God. I do not believe for a second that the Bible is the only way that God speaks, but its purity as God's Word illuminates an essential baseline that is critical to understand who God is and how He perceives the world. The barrier to entry on reading the Bible is high. If you haven't spent much time reading it, then it's easy to get frustrated and claim that you don't understand what's going on. I'm going to have a separate episode addressing this issue in the future, but know that if you are persistent, that it will start to come together over time. For most people, the New Testament is an easier place to begin because those books tend to state their point more directly. It's much easier to listen to a parable, a short story with a specific and often reiterated takeaway, than a random story from the Old Testament that is focused more thematically than directly. That said, I'm a huge Old Testament fan because once you understand those themes, I believe that they tell some of the most beautiful stories ever recorded. I want to make a special note here that when I say read the Bible, I don't mean listen to a bunch of sermons. Sermons are good, but they rarely teach you about God's voice. There are some pastors that teach very directly from the Bible, reading as they go, but in general, sermons will pull out the lessons and present that instead of letting the Bible speak. I'm not judging this one way or another, but for purposes of learning to discern God's voice, that style of preaching is generally unhelpful. The next way that I recommend that you start learning God's voice is to spend real time with someone that is both wiser and more connected to God than you. Ask these people questions and listen to what they have to say. Even someone that is only a few steps ahead of you in the process can be an invaluable asset in attempting to discern what God's voice sounds like. If you can surround yourself with multiple people of this type, all the better. You don't have to ask for or receive any specific advice. Just ask them to talk about times when God stepped into their life and how that worked. How did they know? Did they know? What would they have done differently in response? Were there any signs that they missed along the way? My grandmother died several years ago, and I like to say that she persisted through the last several years of her life only so that she could pray for her children and grandchildren. We had many conversations about faith while she was alive, but it was mostly surface level things. I wish now that I had talked to her more directly about prayer, because that was obviously something that she took very seriously, and I'm ashamed to say that I never fully learned why. The final method that I'm aware of regarding discerning God's voice is through trial and error. Approaching God this way is messy and takes lots of time, but if you are careful, it can work. So what are we listening for, and how do we know when we hear it? I've been told that God speaks to people through visions, dreams, or an audible voice, and I believe several of the people that have told me these things, but I have rarely experienced anything that profound in my own life. Often I find that God speaks in much more subtle ways. For the most part, people seem to accept that there is such thing as a conscience, and I think that in general we all know the feeling that encapsulates that idea. A slight pull that encourages you to reconsider an idea. It's not an overwhelming force generally, but a small signal that something is wrong. While I would argue that your conscience also conveys the voice of God, I don't know that I need to make that argument here. I find that there are many similar feelings that you can attune yourself to that will create opportunities for God to step into your life, but they are also small and subtle, so you need to be attentive to them and attempt to discern what they mean. I want to make it clear that I don't think that every ache or twinge of your body means something. But I do believe that if you start listening to your body, you will learn that much more than your conscience and your gut exist. Another way that I often hear from God is through my thoughts. Sometimes I will have an idea that gets stuck in my head for an extended period of time. This can be either normal brain activity or God trying to draw my attention to something important. I've also had the experience of finding thoughts in my head that aren't mine. The second one is quite rare, but usually gets my immediate attention, and occasionally I have attributed these thoughts to God. I will have a specific podcast both on auditing your thoughts and on a specific instance of finding a thought that wasn't mine in future episodes. The final way that I know to hear God's voice is a stirring of your spirit. I realize that there isn't much of a difference between this and feeling something in your body, but I think that people are better able to discern this one, so I chose to address it separately. Think about a time when you engaged in powerful worship, maybe how you feel when you sing your favorite song. I believe that there are certain instances where our spirit comes alive more than others. Start to pay attention to those instances. What was happening? Who was around? Look for themes or patterns. I believe that this feeling has a particular power to lead you towards your passions and callings in life. Don't ignore it. God speaks subtly, quietly, and in the beginning you won't know exactly what he sounds like. As such, you will need to put yourself in the best possible position to hear him. Get alone, undistracted, pray for him to speak, and then wait. Do this over and over and over again. In the meantime, live your life expectant to hear something at any moment. Draw your attention to what God is doing in you and in your immediate surroundings. Eventually, you will hear something. I just heard a song, and it stirred something in my spirit. I'm currently stuck driving home in a blizzard for the third time this year, and I'm frustrated. I keep thinking about my friend that is going through a tough time. I feel stuck in my business. I'm a first-time dad, and I feel an overwhelming urge to go make a bunch of money. I just walked into a new church, and I could feel God's presence. I just had an argument with my son, and I don't like the way that I feel afterwards. I hear a voice in my head telling me over and over again to build men. These are all examples of actual situations where God has spoken into my life over the last several years. Some of these things were simple fixes, and others took years of exploration and pursuit. But these are the types of things that I call triggers. You will run into a lot of triggers if you pay attention. So is this particular trigger a God thing? Likely you won't know. Maybe it was just a stray thought or a random feeling. At this point, that isn't really important. What did the trigger tell you to do? How do you want to respond? If what it is telling you to do is low risk, do it. In the beginning, it will feel extremely awkward exploring these seemingly random intrusions into your day. And in the short term, it might not feel like you are making any progress. But all feedback is valuable. If you follow a feeling or a stray thought and it doesn't work out, then you can know not to trust it or attempt to interpret it differently. At this point, you are simply trying to pay attention and generate experience. Eventually, you will land on something that works. You still won't know for certain if God is involved, but positive feedback is more valuable than negative, so start to weigh that particular feeling or type of thought more strongly. Keep going. Keep being faithful. Eventually, you will find a path that you start to trust consistently. Then it's time to consider taking a real risk. Once you have a trusted means of communication with God, expect something bigger and more dangerous to show up. Maybe you hear something tell you to quit your job or move across the country. Maybe you have to face a friend or family member about something that you have been avoiding. I wouldn't start with any of those things right out the gate, but as you get more experience, you will be able to hear things more clearly, and God may increase the size of the ask. Faith isn't about being comfortable. It's about believing that God's ways are superior to your own, in spite of your hesitation or objections. At some point, if you continue to build this skill, you will find that following God in these moments leads to transformative experiences for you and others. But at the same time, you are asked to sacrifice your comfort and autonomy in the process. But that's not where we start. For now, start to pay attention to triggers and attempt to discern what they mean. In a few weeks, I'll walk you guys through our battle plan template, which is designed to help take on some of the bigger or more complicated triggers that you might face. In the meantime, feed your spirit. Pray for clarity, read the Bible, tell God how crazy you feel about all this dumb stuff that you heard about on a random podcast. This process falls very strongly under the umbrella of self, so make sure that you are getting good sleep and tending to your mind and body. Don't expect that you can neglect yourself and have a strong connection with God. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Altered Call podcast. You can reach me by email using alex@alteredcall.com, or you can visit the website for additional information.